We'll go our way, you go yours. Why a dispute over Turkish anti-terror laws is threatening the entire refugee deal with Europe. Also on today's program, the standoff at Kenya's anniversary towers. Police disperse opposition protests with tear gas and water cannon. And in Picture This, calls for a new constitution. Nepal's Madhesis take their fight for autonomy to the capital, Kathmandu. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garza. It's been 2 months since the EU agreed a refugee deal with Turkey. It immediately reduced the flow of people going from Turkey to Europe's shores by 90%. But the deal relies on Turkey being granted visa-free travel to Europe in return for meeting 72 requirements set by the EU. Turkey has met most of those, but sticking points still remain, not least over Turkey's anti-terror law. The deal is supposed to be in place by the end of June, but with neither side appearing ready to back down, it could put the whole agreement in doubt. Today's newsmaker then is the EU-Turkey deal, as we ask if it can still be saved.
Bize de vize kaldıracağım. Bunun şartı şunu değiştirmen. Kusura bakma. Hadi bakalım. Biz yolumuza gidiyoruz. Sen de yoluna git.
Den größten Wert darauf, dass die Bedingungen, die Voraussetzungen erfüllt sind. Ansonsten als diesen Deal, dann wird das nicht stattfinden.
The change of tone was unexpected. The political deal agreed in March between the EU and Turkey seemed to be going the right way. The number of refugees crossing the Aegean was down, and Turkish citizens were preparing to travel to Europe without visas for the first time. But that deal is now on the rocks. To finalize the agreement, the EU asked Ankara to meet 5 remaining requirements, including changing its anti-terror law. But President Recep Tayyip Erdogan refuses to amend the law he says is crucial to Turkey's fight against terrorism. At stake is a fragile relationship between the EU and Turkey, an aspiring member of the club, and in the balance, the lives of hundreds of thousands of refugees. The deal was designed to stop refugees from illegally entering Europe and curb a crisis that's seen more than 1 million people, mainly from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, enter Europe since last year. Under the terms, people denied asylum in Europe should be returned to Turkey. In exchange, Syrian refugees in Turkey should be relocated to the EU. Turkey has been stepping up its crackdown on people smugglers and is set to get 3 billion euros from the EU in aid. In return, Turkey wants its citizens to get visa-free travel to Europe's passport-free Schengen zone. But this part of the deal is not complete, as 5 EU benchmarks still need to be met. They include measures to prevent corruption, joining the EU's police agency Europol, working with the EU on judicial matters, updating data protection laws, and changing some anti-terror laws. And over the last point, it looks like the deal could collapse. Behind the blame game, it's the refugees who feel most left out. From inside a Greek detention camp, the EU-Turkey deal looks particularly unfair.
The visa's given to Turkey. What are the people going to do here? We are stuck between 2 fires now. We ran away from a war. Now all the Turkish people are going to go to Europe. They will walk around freely in Europe while we are stuck here.
But aid workers also criticize what they call human trading. Meanwhile, detention centers in Greece are overflowing. In the struggle to process everyone, less than 30% of arrivals since March have been returned to Turkey. If this deal fails, and if there's any increase in numbers, life for people here could become very difficult. Sandra Gathmann, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss whether this could derail the EU-Turkey deal is Elif Özmenek Çarmıklı. She's director of USAC's Center for Social Research and joins me from Ankara. And in Athens is journalist who's been covering the refugee crisis for the past 2 years, Andrew Connelly. Thanks both of you for joining us. Andrew, I want to start with something that just dropped today in the Telegraph. It's a European Commission report that they're quoting, which says that foreign terrorists and organized criminals are expected to seek Turkish passports to reach continental Europe as soon as the visa waiver program comes into force. Are you buying any of that, Andrew?
It could happen. The majority of terrorist attacks we've seen recently in Europe has been committed by Europeans with European passports. They have gone to and back from Syria, and some of them using the Balkan route, which is now shut down. But there are a few ironies about the EU-Turkey deal I think we need to discuss.
Don't move on yet. I just want to stick with this for a second and get Elif's viewpoint, and then we'll come back to you and we can sort of tease this out as we go along. Elif, that same Telegraph piece says, quotes Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of the MI6, who warned that the decision to give Turkey visa-free travel is perverse and compared it to storing gasoline next to the fire. It also warns of populist uprising in Europe, presumably the far right. How seriously do you take any of those warnings, Elif?
Well, as Andrew said, it might happen, but I think when we're, talking about these kind of news, we have to be very careful, and we should really separate the politics from the humanitarian side of this whole thing, because if you start labeling all the refugees or, Turkish deal about the visa facilitation or visa liberalization to this criminalization of the issue, then I think it will be a bigger political problem. So I understand what is the concern, but I see it with a question mark.
Okay. Now that we've hung that question mark on that, let's move on. Andrew, let me allow you to explore what you wanted to explore, but let me preface it by saying the number of arrivals in Greece since the deal was struck, sure, the Turks haven't got what they were promised, the visa-free deal, but the number of arrivals is dramatically down, and the popular consensus is it's due to the deal. You would dispute that, wouldn't you?
I would. That's not to say that Turkey hasn't made efforts to prevent some of the boat traffic in the Aegean Sea. It's always done that here and there. It's certainly made a bigger effort recently. But again, for the best part of a year, it was an orgy of smuggled boats going across the Aegean, and such a massive business cannot exist without the connivance of Coast Guard, of police, of political figures, and of mafia kingpins in Turkey. So it's quite cute that, after doing it not so much before, now the money's been handed over. They have made more of an effort. The second thing is actually the main factor in the decline in the arrivals in Greece is not really anything to do with the EU-Turkey deal. It's the unilateral border closures of the Balkans, most importantly the border of Greece and Macedonia, which was largely organized by Macedonia and other Central European countries like Hungary and Slovakia, which don't much care for refugees, and also Austria, which lies at the top of the Balkan route. So this is what refugees say in Turkey when you ask them why they're not crossing, because they can't get out of Greece. Certainly, the EU-Turkey deal has disincentivized the crossing of the Aegean Sea, because you more or less get detained on arrival and most people will be deported to Turkey and to an unknown fate. But there's a bit of an irony in Europe trying to stop the flow of migration of refugees by basically giving the opportunity for upwards of 80 million Turkish people to visit Europe visa-free.
Interesting. Elif, so Andrew believes it's those border closures, particularly in the Balkans, that's really stemming the flow, not so much the deal. What do you think?
Well, to a certain extent, I agree with Andrew, but on the other hand, I mean, if you're talking about 90% drop in the passages, that shows us a couple of things. One, as much as law enforcement, political will is vital. And two, international cooperation, and this happens in front of the media. So I think those play a very important role as well. And when we talk to the refugees here, the Syrian refugees, why actually they stopped going to the EU. They're kind of talking about the EU-Turkey deal as well, because they know that they will be sent back, so why bother, why spend money? And I think at this point they're actually waiting, you know, because human smuggling and human mobility is like water. You really can't stop by closing the borders. And, you know, we have a huge literature on this. You close one border, they move to the other one. So they're like water. And I think at this point, refugees themselves are taking some strategic decisions as well and waiting for the political decisions, you know, or the outcomes of it.
Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu said, telling us to change our anti-terror law at a time when we are fighting against the PKK and Daesh amounts to supporting terrorism. We will never give in to such impositions. Do you think Turkey's not being flexible enough, Andrew?
I can understand the sensitivity of Turkey being told what to do when it is involved in the insurgency with the Kurds, but it's really, the backdrop is the precipitous decline of human rights in Turkey. We see government raids on critical newspapers. We see journalists being imprisoned for doing their job, for reporting on uncomfortable truths for the government. And essentially the EU has to more or less look the other way if this deal has to go through. That, as a lot of anti-terrorism legislation that we've seen in America and Europe, the UK, France, Germany, you name it, it's always abused, and it obviously can target terrorists. A lot of the times it's used to suppress journalists, activists and political dissidents. Turkey is purely using a playbook from other Western countries.
Then
I would say
let me follow up then. Let me follow up and ask, with, you know, the prevalence of Daesh attacks, the PKK, the TAK and others attacking the southeast, attacking the capital Ankara, attacking Istanbul, attacking Bursa, military, civilians and others, you name it. How does the EU suggest Turkey stops this? Because there seems to be this feeling that it's okay for France after November to have a state of emergency and have 3,500 warrantless raids, and that's okay because it's fighting terror, but Turkey can't really do the same. Can we maybe agree that the EU hasn't tried to contextualize it or try to understand the Turkish point of view here?
We can absolutely say that the EU hasn't tried to contextualize that. We can also say, if we just momentarily return to the EU-Turkey deal, that this sort of grasping, desperate, quite grubby attempt by the EU to pay off Turkey to keep refugees there is also having impacts elsewhere in the world. On May the 1st, the West African country of Niger asked the EU for €1 billion to act as a bulwark of migrants, of African migrants trying to go through Libya across the central Mediterranean route to Italy, which is a route that's picking up these days. Then last week, the Kenyan government said it would shut down the biggest refugee camp in the world, Dadaab, which hosts over 500,000 mainly displaced Somalis, because Europe is basically saying refugees are not good enough for us. So many countries in the developing world are saying, well, why should there be double standards? Why should we get to host them all? And in fact, it's the case that most refugees in the world are hosted by developing states and not getting enough support from the West. So they're setting an extremely bad example that's having repercussions. The EU is getting shaken down by more countries.
Right. Elif, with so much of the optimism sucked out of this deal on both sides, who or what can revive it? Who or what can save it?
Well, I think, just to back up a little and try to answer what you asked to Andrew, the main problem here is this, it's not about anti-terror law, it's not about, that 5 criteria. I think the major problem here, what the EU is missing, they kind of move themselves, being an anchor position in Turkey's democratization, and shifted or name Turkey as a buffer state, rather, a privileged partner. And once you do that, the major problem here is you really don't have anything or ability to say anything about Turkey's democratization from there on. So I think the major problem here, the EU really should go back to the membership track and really work on that. I understand, they're going through a crisis and they're acting very pragmatically, but the major problem is Turkey is a candidate country, and they should, it should be treated as such. So, and when we come back to your question, what can, how can it get back to track? Well, to be honest, I think they're just trying to buy time right now. And at this point, two sides really should trust each other. They're on the same boat. If the boat sinks, they're going to both go down together. I mean, we're talking about 3 million people who really need desperate help. I understand it's a political issue, but it's a humanitarian issue as well. I mean, the EU should really understand there's a problem, a humanitarian problem, and it's a EU-centered problem because these people want to go to the EU. So at this point, they should really understand this is a refugee policy crisis rather than a refugee crisis. I mean, building up trust, and that trust really should go through the contextualization of the criteria and the demands, and also the promises should be kept, from both sides.
Okay, I'd love to. Unfortunately, Elif, I'd love to throw in a few more questions, but we have run out of time. This is a very tight show, and we've got to move on. Elif, Özmenek, Çarmıklı, and Andrew Connelly, thank you both for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Kenyan police stamp out opposition protests. And in Picture This, the latest challenge to Nepal's new constitution. Kenyan police have used tear gas and water cannon to clear protesters from the offices of the Electoral Commission. Opposition groups say the body is biased and needs reform. With a year to go until the country holds national elections, the opposition says it will keep protesting until its demands are met. The Newsmakers' Yvette McCullough reports.
Fighting between police and protesters in Kenya's capital. Tear gas and water cannon are fired at hundreds of opposition supporters on the streets of Nairobi. It's the third time protests have turned violent in less than a month. And riot police are being accused of using excessive force. These people are protesting against the election oversight body, the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. They say it is corrupt and biased, and are calling for its staff to resign. Kenya doesn't hold elections until next year, but politicians are already trying to mobilise supporters. Raila Odinga, the opposition leader and President Uhuru Kenyatta's biggest rival. He says Kenya's elections cannot be free and fair under the IEBC's watch. In a tweet, he said Kenyans are tired of the incompetence and corruption exhibited by the electoral body as presently constituted. Raila Odinga lost to President Uhuru Kenyatta in 2013. He challenged the result in court, questioning the elections process, but he failed. Raila Odinga is now calling on his supporters to protest every week until the IEBC is reformed. It's a worrying start to election campaigning in a country with a recent history of elections inciting violence. At least 1,200 people were killed in ethnic violence that broke out after the presidential vote in 2007. Current President Kenyatta and his deputy William Ruto had to face International Criminal Court charges, accused of orchestrating the violence. But there were concerns over witness interference, and both cases were abandoned. Kenyatta plans to stand for a second term in 2017, and with the opposition's challenge to the IEBC likely to continue, there's concern the violence could escalate. Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss the clashes in Kenya and what they mean for next year's elections is Benji Ndolo. He's the founder and director of the Organization for National Empowerment in Nairobi. Thanks a lot for joining us. We've seen some horrendous images. There's a curb kick. There were lots of awful images that we've seen over the past 24 hours coming through. How do you feel when you see those images?
People are angry. People feel that this is a regression back to the days of tyranny, single-party rule in the 20th century, particularly 1990, 91, the struggle for multi-party system of government. And so there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anger all at the same time. And also these images serve to divide the country further. There's very serious, deep tribal sentiment with it. Most regrettable, especially because only 6 years ago, this country passed a very progressive, liberal constitution that guarantees in the Bill of Rights, freedom of assembly, rights to picket, assemble, and all of that. So very disappointing pictures from the last 24 hours, as you say. And as a result of one of the assaults by a police officer, we're told that today one of these young people has actually lost his life.
Now, tell us in a nutshell, the protesters firmly believe that the election officials are biased. This is why they are protesting. Are they right?
Certainly there's issues with the Electoral Commission. Their conduct throughout, from before the elections, on procurement of BVR kits, to making biased statements against some of the candidates, calling some of the candidates perennial losers, to suspicions of corruption, getting compromised, receiving bribes. Employees of Smith Usman in the UK that sent bribes over the period from 2010 have been proven to have sent those bribes to commissioners in Kenya and have been convicted and jailed in the UK, while here these commissioners continue in office, continue making very stubborn statements, etc., and so are now perceived to be openly biased and biased towards one side of the political divide.
Fascinating. Now, you mentioned those new laws that came in just a handful of years ago to try and
Absolutely.
protect the country. As far as I understand, a lot of it was to ensure that the horrendous scenes that we saw in 2007 don't repeat themselves, where more than 1,000 people died. You had the supporters of Mr. Odinga on the one side and the supporters of Mr. Kibaki on the other. I mean, does this really feel as bad as that? Is there really the possibility of a slippery slope of us going into that hardcore political and tribal violence of 2007?
To be honest, the divisions are even deeper. The anger, the resentment, the tribal sentiments are even worse. Certain communities feel, rightly or wrongly, that the message that has gone out is that they don't deserve to be in the presidency. Other communities feel, rightly or wrongly, that they are from a tribe that is born to lead. Now, this is obviously very dangerous, and I believe that the overreach by the Cabinet Secretary in Interior is meant to send a clear signal that the government will move hard to quash any attempt at rejecting results or at mass action. Now, this in itself is problematic. And by the way, as of this afternoon, Kenyans do feel that they are very alone, that the international community, it's not clear where they stand, that the ICC process didn't yield anything whatsoever. So these are very frustrating times for the country, and there's a lot of uncertainty.
Well, that is very disturbing and an ominous situation indeed. Benji Ndolo, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate the interview. In today's Picture This, protesters from southern Nepal have fought with riot police for a second day in the capital, Kathmandu. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker was the EU-Turkey deal, as we ask if it could still be saved. The rhetoric from both sides has so far been fairly uncompromising, but there is some reason for hope. There's talk of delaying the deal until October and murmurings of a possible compromise on the European side. What's crucial is establishing who needs this deal more and if it's actually the right way forward for both sides. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.